I am Martina Mitz, and hold on, I know that name is quite overwhelming for most of the people, so that's why I go with the user-friendly abbreviation Martina Mitz. Who I am, what's relevant to you, pretty much is in 1998 when I came to Germany. I started learning myself web design, inspired by my brother back then, as I wanted to have my own website. And then in 2001, I had the first small project to create the web presence for someone. And throughout the years, I've worked with many small local businesses to create their websites. And that was pretty much the case until shortly before 2007, when I started finalized my study in psychology. And then I started working in the clinical psychology, which I managed almost a year before I realized I'm missing something. And actually, it's the combination of my hobby and my profession that will be the perfect job for me. It took another year until I found a label that suited my mindset, and I finally became a UX designer, or unofficial UX designer. And being such, I also approach the topic finding in a user-centered way. So I asked various colleagues of mine, UX colleagues, but also from neighboring disciplines, which the current UX topics are that they're most interested in. And I was very surprised to see a very strong demand for a clarification between UX and UI. And I was surprised, as I didn't expect that from UX specialists and experts. But on the other hand, going through many job offers recently and seeing the broad confusion there, I could totally feel where that demand is coming from. On the other hand, though, one of my personal challenges is when someone asks me what I do for a living. And mostly when it's another person asking me, someone that is not very familiar with the digital world, I do experiment with different explanations. And it's a challenge. It's a big challenge to really precisely explain what I do. Once I succeed, though, most of the people agree, actually all the people agree that I have one amazing, very exciting job. So I think it's worth it to try to simplify, or better said, to clarify and better define the language we use as, or the UX language, the language we use as UX specialist, so that that can ensure a broader understanding of that discipline or that kind of thinking. But also make it more accessible to people standing on the outside, for example, a lot of managers or recruiters. That's why I think actually starting with the difference between user experience and user interface design is a great start to bring some light into the whole UX language. I actually prepared a slide already for that, as I found two very nice definitions of the terms. So let's start with UX. UX stands for user experience. And this, what you see here, is the oldest definition of UX, the oldest official definition of UX, made by Don Norman, who we'll come back to in a second. So he stated that user experience encompasses all aspects of the end user's interaction with the company, its services, and its products. Where on the other hand, UI stands for user interface. And I found this nice definition, nice short, simple definition in techterms.com, which says that user interface is the means in which a person controls a software application or a hardware device. And as you can actually probably already see, there is a very strong digital focus in the UI definition. So it's the surface with which a person and a machine interact. And this is what user interface designer is responsible for. Where on the other hand, UX or a UX designer is more responsible for all aspects of the interaction. So it means a more holistic picture of the human product, service, or machine interaction. And this one can, this difference actually, or this focus can also be seen in the evolving of these two disciplines. So let me take you back in the past very shortly to show you a couple of milestones for the evolving of these two disciplines. If we start with UX design and actually the idea of user-centered thinking, we could actually go back to ancient times to find beginnings of such thinking practices. But let us just look at the past century, and here one can see very big shift that happened starting from the beginning of last century, where the focus was more on the masses and the mass production. Very important are the works from Taylor and also from Frederick Taylor, and also from Henry Ford. So they both worked on the methods of scientific management, was it called. So they both were very interested in the human-tool interaction, but their focus was rather on the efficiency and the productivity of the people. And then there was a slight shift towards the middle of last century after the two world wars. Towards the middle of last century, the importance of the single individual started growing. So very important works towards the end of the 40s and the beginning of the 50s are undoubtedly the works of Toyota, the user centricity of Toyota, or the worker centricity of Toyota, which started looking for the opinions of their workers and came to great success, and also draw a lot of attention to their user-centered or worker-centered methods. But also there was another guy who was very interesting, who worked in Bell Labs, called John Carlin, who in the end of the 40s already has organized a user preference department in Bell Labs, where they observed users using the telephone and started improving this. And then another work which is very important, and actually is the first work that states kind of the rules for successful user experience design, is Designing for People, the book Designing for People by Henry who set rules for the contact between people and products or machines. Um, and he wrote in his book, if people are made safer, more comfortable, more eager to purchase, and more efficient, or just plain happier by contact with the product, then the designer has succeeded. And this is pretty much what's also valid until today. Now, let us take a short excursus to the digital revolution that started in the beginning of the 70s. As this is the actual groundbreaking moment that supported the evolving of these two disciplines. Towards the end of the 60s, there was one amazing presentation that's also called the mother of all presentations by Douglas Engelbart, who presented the first mouse and also was able to navigate a remote computer, which was a text-based interface, to navigate through this mouse, through the text links. Which was groundbreaking at that time. And his vision for a graphical user interface that's being navigated by the user with the help of a mouse was further developed by Bob Taylor, another Taylor, who was a psychologist and a computer scientist, and worked at PARC, the Palo Alto Research Center of Xerox. And he, very inspired by the presentation and the vision of Engelbart's mouse, started experimenting on computers with graphical user interfaces. And what you see there on the slide is in 1973, the first computer with a graphical interface that wasn't for commercial use though, but it was the start, and it also integrated a mouse next to a small keyboard. So working further on developing the graphical user interface computers, or shortly abbreviated GUI, for graphical interface, it took till the beginning of the 80s until Xerox was able to release the first commercial graphical user interface computer, the Xerox Star, which though wasn't very successful, as it was simply unaffordable. And then it was in the beginning of the 80s that actually the first popular graphical user interface computers came on the market, which were Amiga and also, as we know them today, Apple and Windows in their very, very early form. So this digital evolution was actually the time where both disciplines, user experience design, but strongly user interface design, became popular. It actually took another decade until 1995, until the first person officially called himself user experience architect, and also defined user experience, and that was Don Norman that I've mentioned before. As you can see on the following slide, I try to show the process of both design disciplines, or actually it's not a process, but what it implies, what each discipline implies. And to start with explaining that in more detail, I would simply state that UX design is responsible for designing the flow or the behavior of a product or a service. And this is how it's actually responsible for the feel of a product. Where on the other hand, UI design is the one that defines the look of a product, and so the visuals of a product. And let's start with that explanation, although it's not quite exact. Let's start with it to go further and make it more clear. So as said before, UX design is that discipline that's responsible for the overall feel of a product, or it can be a service as well. So although we can't design feelings or direct experiences in people, what we can do is design the character or the behavior of a certain product or a certain service, and therefore invoke certain emotions in people. And for that, UX design actually encompasses many disciplines. The common in that including of disciplines is actually that the user is in the center. Therefore, it's also called user-centered design, or abbreviated UCD. A UX designer is usually creates a holistic concept of a product or a service, and that is normally based on user feedback. So there is some primary pre-concept user research that's taking place in many cases. And then it depends on the size of the company. In the conception phase, the UX designer will usually strongly collaborate with representatives of the different disciplines. And usually the closest collaboration is between a UX designer, a visual designer or UI designer, and a developer, as these both ensure the feasibility of a product. Some typical tasks of a UX designer are the creation of storyboards to convey certain ideas, or to describe a user path or a user flow, but also the creation of user journey, or also called user journey diagrams, which are based on actual user data gathered before. Then also a sitemap can be created just to visualize the structure and the flows of a homepage. When there is a homepage or an existing product already, or a service, also an evaluation in the form of an expert review can take place. Out of the user data gathered before, usually personas are being created, so to ensure that everyone is aware and also fine with the user types designed for. And then starting with rough concepts, this can be in forms of sketches, going through low fidelity wireframes, which are actually the digital blueprints of usually a website, a digital product. But also, as I said, depending on the company's size, many times a UX designer will also create high fidelity mockups, or even pixel perfect designs. And usually the whole process, or the whole active work of the UX designer is wrapped up by an interaction style guide, which is pretty much the documentation of all the rules and the whole system. As you see, or probably see, UX design is a very iterative process, and that is why the actual execution of UI design, which isn't an iterative or it is an iterative process, but changes in the UI design are more effortful. So that is also the reason why it usually the execution of UI design comes towards the end of a project. And a UI designer is usually called graphical user interface designer, as most of the surfaces or user-facing materials or interaction platforms are digital. So being called from GUI, graphical user interface designer, but also all the substitute graphical designer, UI designer, user interface designer, or just interface designer, up to visual designer. So everything, all these terms actually do mean the person that's responsible for the visuals. And I said before, UX on the one hand is the feel, and UI on the other hand is the look. And that is not quite right, because the look also conveys a certain feel. But we'll get back to that in a second. A UI designer responsible for the aesthetics and the visuals of a product, usually, for example, when it's again about a homepage or a website, is responsible for the layout of the website, the colors, the fonts and symbols, or called icons, and also buttons and links, but also form elements, which all together are called the UI elements. Some typical tasks of a UI designer, and I'm sure a UI designer will be better of listing everything here. I don't want to make anyone's job smaller than it is, but from the UI designers that I've worked with, many of the deliverables or tasks I've seen are usually starting with a mood board. So creating a mood world for a certain style or design system. Then creating design mockups, which are usually very closely discussed with UX designer and developer. And then going to pixel perfect designs, defining all UI elements, creating assets for the developer, design specifications also for the developers, and then usually wrapping all up, if there isn't any before, in a visual style guide, which pretty much is the guideline for the look of a product. And now that's where the interesting point comes. As I said, the look and the feel isn't quite right, as the look already conveys a certain feeling. So a practical example is, for example, when I work with a UI designer, and we look at the design mockups, and then I start commenting about the mood of the colors or the design. It might be too heavy for the user, or might be too depressing, too dark, or whatever comments there are that I make. They are on a higher level. So they are in terms of the whole picture of the feel that we want to convey to a human being interacting with that product or service. So don't forget and keep in mind that actually the UI designer is the expert who can go into detail and has the rationale of certain decisions. And also the thing is that a good UI designer can and should actually be user-oriented. So this is where you see the borders become even more fluid and unclear, because we both talk about what it looks like and what it feels like. but then the expert in the what it looks like system is the UI designer. And as I said, I'm the one that will allow myself to only comment on a higher level in terms of the holistic strategy of the user experience. So to make that a bit more clear, I was looking for a couple of visual examples. And when you Google UX versus UI, which I don't like quite much because they aren't versus, they're actually with each other. So, but anyway, when you Google UX versus UI, then there are two examples that you'll surely stumble upon. The first one is this one. So I've called it the example. And why I don't like this that much is because of the term design, which is actually a very generic term. As I said before, I've experimented a lot with explaining the job that I do. So I've used simply design many times, and I see that people not coming from the digital world most often understand fashion design when they hear design. But what is it in this picture? Is it the visual design or the product design? So what we have there is a barrier for, I guess, for vehicles or for bicycles. And then we have sidewalk that can easily be accessed by pedestrians. And then on the very far right, we have a shortcut that people have taken. So as I said, don't like that example quite much because of the generic use of the term design. So this year at UX Sofia, a colleague of mine, Lutz Schmidt, presented a corrected version of that example, which I liked a lot, which pretty much says the barrier and this walk around is a very annoying user experience. And what people have done is to find a less annoying user experience by taking a shortcut around it. And as I said, there is a second example that's the example in the web, which is the cereal example or the breakfast example. So what you see here is the cereal and the dry food, which represent the content. Then we have, remember, the means with which a user interacts with a software program or a hardware device, in this term our hardware device. So we have the means, which is the spoon. This is the user interface. And then we have the cereal in a bowl with the spoon inside, which is here stated as user experience. And I allowed myself to correct that picture slightly, or that example, by actually showing that the cereal in the bowl with the spoon is the product, the ready product. And the user experience is the interaction with the product. So it can be also just seeing it, but the holistic user experience will be the interaction with the cereal by eating it. And then while looking for examples and while thinking about the whole topic, I actually thought many of my job titles have somehow included architecture. And if you remember, Don Norman, the first person who called himself user experience something, called himself a user experience architect. So I was thinking, why not look at architecture and see how it goes there to hopefully find a suitable metaphor. And when you look at that great picture I found here, it shows a room. And I hope you guys, as well as I do, also have a certain feeling when looking at that room. And I wanted to break down for you who is responsible for what part of the feeling that you get. So at a construction, you have the architect who gives the initial idea, and who defines the look and feel of the out and inside of the building in terms of the structure. Then the architect is working very closely with an engineer who makes sure that this idea is feasible in all of its details. The engineer then gives the to-dos, the tasks to the builders, and then at the very end, the interior designer comes and puts all these pink pillows and small furniture and a plant and so on. So why I took this example is because we actually do have pretty much similar, although the project steps are a bit different. But the UX designer is the one that creates the concept or the idea of a product, and then collaborating very strongly with the developer lead, IT lead, but also with the user interface designer. And then it goes to, once the product is assured from all sides, then it goes to building, which is the development in our case. And if everything didn't happen to make it more clear for you, then I would love to show you my last example, which I think is a great one. I found that in internet, and it's about Heinz Ketchup, as many of you probably know it. And it does say on the one side designing the product, and on the other side designing the experience, which is also correct in that case. But to use it in our case, I would like you to quickly concentrate just on the labels of both bottles. So if you look at them, yes, the colors are a bit more bright, maybe the font is a bit stronger, maybe it's just part of the image, and there is a tomato in the plastic, the label on the plastic bottle, but they're not that different. From look, they look quite similar. It's the same brand, and it does give you the same feeling of a label. What's different here is the behavior of both products, and therefore the user experience that you have with them. While the glass bottle that's on the left, the ketchup, when you have less ketchup, it's on the bottom. So to use it, you have to turn it over, you have to start tapping the bottom. And then once the ketchup comes out, it actually is everywhere, and your room looks like after Halloween massacre. Which is greatly solved in the other product. So it's the same product, it's pretty much the same look of a product, but what's different here is the bottle stays on its bottleneck, so the ketchup is always there where it's squeezed from, and also there is this plastic system that makes the squishing of the ketchup much more controllable and much easier. Yeah, as mentioned before, one of the motivations to choose this topic was actually a few or a lot of job descriptions I get recently, and I see how big the misunderstanding of both terms is there. So I've gathered a few examples, and I wanted to show you what I mean there, or what people are looking for. But first, when I was preparing the topic, and then I watched a couple of YouTube videos, and I stumbled upon a suggestion list, and this is what you see here. And then I see the presentation of Jane Ju Jensen, which is actually a great presentation about UX techniques, and a great presentation of methods, UX methods for beginners. But then the title says user interface UX techniques. So as you see, also I think she's a professor or something like that, a very misunderstanding title of the presentation. But that's a rather smaller example. As I promised and as I said, I would like to show you a couple of job descriptions. So the first one that you see here was for a user experience designer. And amongst very different bullet points and what the expectations and so on, description of company, there was this one, engaging and stunning visual design, where I was alarmed immediately. And then I started reading. The UX designer will champion user-focused design, creating ideas and concepts for major brands and organizations. Well, actually, that sounds right. With the ability to produce sketches, wireframes, and prototypes to explain thinking, the UX designer will be hands-on, adopting rapid prototyping and user insights. Well, that also sounds right. So why did I call it visual design, stunning visual design? And now it comes. The role will research audiences, create personas and segmentations to transform client briefs, brand guidelines, and concepts into engaging and stunning visual design. So what we have here is not only looking for a great UX designer, as it seems, but one that is also very good in marketing methods, which is market segmentation and research as well, but also someone who is creating perfect designs. So also a UI designer. So they're looking for 3 people in one. And now let's go to the next one. It gets more and more exciting. So this one was for a senior UI/UX designer. And I have to say, these are my favorite job offers or job descriptions that start with a UI/UX. But let's see what the people meant here. So in the responsibility section, you find this paragraph which states you will be able to not only create high-quality graphics, but the ability to apply them to a user-centered design. I'm not sure what that is supposed to mean. I understand the high-quality graphics, but to apply them to a user-centered design process, that's a bit of a gap there, but let's say they just wanted to sound fancy and continue reading. Excellent HTML and CSS knowledge and the ability to position and control UI elements are necessary, along with an understanding of how to construct designs flexible enough to display across multiple browsers, screen sizes, platforms, and devices. So this is where I got some headaches, because excellent HTML and CSS knowledge. Of course, it's nice to know how the implementation works and what the logic is behind it. But is it crucial for creating a concept, or is rather a good collaboration with the people that work that for years and really know it well, the crucial part or the necessary part? And then it continues, but most importantly, we're looking for a designer that will be able to understand how the user will want to instinctively interact with the UI and provide them with the ability to perform their tasks easily and intuitively. So this is actually the only part, although it's formulated in a strange way, it's actually the only part that is actual UX work. And that for a senior UI UX designer. Now let me give you another example, which is a very short but very outstanding one, as they pretty much summarized everything into a couple of bullet points. And it was for a senior UX designer, so there wasn't any UI here or anything else. And when I started reading and I came to the knowledge and experience section, and I saw that essential is a portfolio of design experience. So here I thought probably they mean the design process. I hope so. Then I read storyboarding, wireframing, and then front-end design and build. So not only do they limit the UX work to storyboarding and wireframing, but I also expect from a UX designer to design the front end and develop it. Amazing. And then the last one I chose, which was also a bit more descriptive, was for a UX designer or a senior UX. I'm not quite sure anymore, but what was interesting was this year about you and the role. With your knowledge and expertise, you will play a key part in generating new ideas and creating designs that are useful and valuable for our customers. Totally agree with that. Totally what I do. You know that good design is invisible and the simplest solution is often the best. Totally know that? Agree. Let's continue reading. You are comfortable taking a data-led approach to your work. Sure, I am, as long as I also get some qualitative data, so I see a couple of real users and not just get the analytics. And you can take an idea from a sketch on a piece of paper through building them with excellently written HTML and CSS. And this is where you lost me, guys. I hope you do have developers in your company, which I would love to work with, but I wouldn't be able to implement excellent HTML or CSS code. And then the last sentence, also amazing. You have a proven track record of outstanding visual design skills, but also the experience of working with an established brand and the ability to adhere to current structured design style. So again, a user experience designer, a front-end developer, and a UI designer in one, 3 in 1. Yeah, so as also mentioned before, I think I'm not a trend researcher, and I think there are people that can answer that question much better and more precise than I do. But my impression and also my wish thinking, my hope, I see that holistic aspect of UX becoming more and more important, and also therefore a stronger attention towards service design or design thinking methods. But I think there is much more clearer differentiation to come in the next few years in that term. Also, I've heard incrementally the term CX being used, which stands for customer experience, which also underlines the holistic but also sustainable aspect and character of UX design work. So it pretty much means get the users, make them to customers, and also develop strategies that are long-term binding the customer. Yeah, creating more value so people also become customers and stay such and are happy with the product. So as I said, I think there is more to come there, and it's very exciting to see where it goes, and probably if we look back at that interview in a couple of years, everything might seem wrong by that time, because it's a young science and it's a lot that's evolving there. So it will be exciting to see the differentiation, but also more clear definitions of the different disciplines or the different directions that user experience design can take. Also, very exciting times that we live in because of the technical innovations. So it hasn't stopped. The technique is still evolving. We nowadays have wearables and, for example, and therefore also different usage contexts. And that's a challenge, but also a very exciting time for all kinds of designers, for UX designers especially, as we have to consider a more multifaceted experience, but also for UI designers, as it's quite challenging to have to press everything on a very small screen. So as I said, again, repeating myself, but it's very, very exciting to be a UX designer right now and to be a part of evolving of that very young discipline. Yeah, and I think also the institutionalization of the science will be very interesting in terms of studies in the universities and diplomas and different paths of making it official, spreading the word, and gaining broader understanding for the importance of user-centered design.